Hello friends, my name is JJ, and today we are going to attempt to answer the question, what happened in 2024 that actually mattered? Like, what were the things that happened in the past year that people are still going to care about 10, 20, 30 or more years from now? This is the problem with ordinary year-in-review type stuff. They do a good job of documenting what happened, but fall off when it comes to weighing the relative importance of it all. But not here on this channel. No, today I'm going to tell you about my picks for the 7 2024 things that I think will become a permanent part of the American cultural canon, which is to say the things that culturally literate Americans will still be expected to know and understand long after the unknown and Peanut the Squirrel are gathering mold in history's back alley. So, my first thing is going to be the Trump shooting. It was hard to pick just one Trump-related thing this year, just because this was obviously a very political year and Trump was its defining figure, the person of the year, you might even say. Donald Trump has himself obviously been part of the American cultural canon for a very long time. His whole political career has been built on his decades of pre-existing fame, in fact. But that doesn't mean that various other cultural things associated with him can't also enter the cultural canon independently. The fact that he got reelected to a second non-consecutive term, for instance, is a big development in our cultural understanding of the American presidency. It has happened before, but not in the lifetimes of anyone currently living. For the last 100 years or so, in fact, a pretty firm cultural norm had been established that when a president loses re-election, he leaves politics forever.
Hey, no one-termers.
You two, huh? Hey, I know a good yogurt place.
Get away from me, loser.
The fact that this century-old taboo has now been broken, and that all modern posters and things of the presidents will vividly remind us that it is both possible and acceptable for defeated presidents to run again, will almost certainly play a role in how future one-term presidents choose to conduct themselves. Trump's criminal conviction in May was likewise a big development in that he is now set to become America's first felon president, which is an even more unprecedented development for the US presidency. Though we will have to see if Trump keeps that status for more than a few hours. And next year, we are talking about the new development of presidents pardoning themselves. But in any case, the biggest Trump-related cultural phenomenon was almost certainly the assassination attempt made against him on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania. I know that there was another attempt on his life a couple months later as well, but I really doubt that anybody is going to remember that one any more than we remember the 2011 attempt to kill President Obama. The Butler attempt, however, was dramatic and cinematic and made all the more theatrical by this incredible photograph by Evan Vucci, easily the photo of the year and surely set to be one of the decade. Given that Trump didn't die, however, and wasn't even particularly injured, this assassination attempt obviously won't be anywhere as important as the JFK shooting or anything. But this is still one of those big, flashy, photogenic events that people will always remember, even if just as a spectacle to parody. In other Trump-related news, his return to the White House also introduced a new name to the list of American politicians that everyone is expected to know: Vice President J.D. Vance. Vance is Trump's second vice president, something that became necessary after he turned so fanatically against the previous one, who had refused to assist in his conspiracy to stay in power after losing the 2020 election. So, J.D. Vance first burst onto the scene in 2016 after writing a best-selling memoir about his disturbing upbringing in rural Ohio. In those days, Vance was considered a pretty middle-of-the-road, conventional type of conservative, whose big argument was that a lot of the poor, white working class were basically architects of much of their own misfortune. He was deeply skeptical of Trump, who he called a peddler of cultural heroin that distracted lower-class voters from their personal responsibilities. In the years following Trump's first election, however, Vance made a pretty sharp turn and became an increasingly devoted Trump supporter, eventually getting elected to the Senate as a MAGA Republican. In this role, he became well known for serving as an intermediary between the world of formal politics and the internet's growing subculture of far-right intellectuals, activists, and social media personalities.
There's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
Since Trump is now in the unusual position of starting a new term that will also be his last, we can expect that jockeying to be the next Republican presidential candidate will be one of the big themes of the next 4 years, with Vance one of the main characters in this succession drama. But that said, vice presidents have a tendency to quickly fade into the background, and Vance has never been terribly well-liked. A guy who might wind up looming larger in the world of the second Trump term would be my next addition to the cultural canon, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So, the Kennedys are obviously the most famous political family in American history, and it's quite remarkable that they've been able to maintain their cultural relevance for as long as they have. Every generation, in fact, seems to adopt a new Kennedy to serve as figurehead of the times. Joseph Kennedy as an America First isolationist in the lead up to World War II. John F. Kennedy as a symbol of mid-century optimism. Robert Kennedy as a leader of young activists in the 60s. And then Ted Kennedy serving several decades in the Senate as the lion of mainstream American liberalism. And now, after a brief interregnum, we have Robert Kennedy Jr. as a guy who has proven to be very exciting to a new coalition of anti-establishment populists and conspiracy theorists that have become the backbone of Trump's MAGA movement. RFK Jr. had started to make a name for himself in recent years as a figure within America's alternative health and wellness subculture that rejects a great deal of quote-unquote mainstream medicine and medical advice, most notably vaccines. Being a vaccine skeptic used to be a somewhat pan-ideological identity, with factions on both the more hippie-ish naturopathic left as well as the evangelical Christian right. But the COVID vaccines and the mandates around them proved to be a real deal breaker for the progressive faction and caused many of them, like RFK, to defect to Trump, which was of course fairly ironic because Trump's administration was responsible for the COVID vaccines in the first place, but that has never really bothered anyone for some reason. RFK Jr. ran for president as a Democrat against Joe Biden before dropping out to run briefly as an independent, and then dropping out a second time to endorse Donald Trump, who in turn, at the time of this filming, has stated an intent to make him the head of the US Health Department. Kennedy remains very popular with the general public, certainly more popular than Trump himself, meaning that there is good reason to suspect that his endorsement might have played a not insignificant role in helping Trump get elected. And that speaks to the growing clout of the more conspiratorial faction of MAGA, embodied by a growing array of populist characters, including Tulsi Gabbard, Joe Rogan, and Alex Jones, who didn't think of identifying as Republicans until Trump came along. But it is RFK who, by virtue of being a Kennedy, feels like the one who is least likely to be forgotten. Okay, so that was a lot of politics, but like I said, it was a very political year. But in any case, let us now move on to some less political things. So I think by now it is clear that the 2020s are going to be defined as the start of the AI era. What is less clear, however, is whether this is going to be an era of long and lasting cultural significance, like the television era or the internet era, or something more brief, faddish, and ultimately underwhelming, like, say, the Laserdisc era. What is clear, however, is that when we say AI these days, we mean a technology able to produce writing or pictures, so-called generative AI, which is a bit different than how we've previously thought of AI, which was as more of a robot thing. Nevertheless, generative AI has now been integrated into an enormous amount of websites and apps that give users the ability to casually generate things like form letters, emails, clip art, and all sorts of other stuff. And this tech has now become so mainstream that I feel like 2024 marked the moment where the culture established a definitive symbol for what we need to press or click whenever we want to auto-generate content of this sort. And the symbol is this thing. I feel like this sparkle was suddenly everywhere in 2024, from ads on billboards to illustrations in the Atlantic. It's been a while since a new form of technology has gone so mainstream that we've all had to learn a new symbol to represent it. Wi-Fi arcs might be the last great one. Or maybe this cigarette with the lightning bolt coming out of it that you see on no vaping signs. Speaking of symbols, another one that really entered the mainstream this year was this version of the LGBT+ pride flag. So I talked a bit about the history of the pride flag in a previous award-winning video, and how it went from this, to briefly this, to this, with this version being created by Daniel Quasar in 2018. The motivation for these changes was, of course, to make the pride flag more inclusive by incorporating new colored lines representing trans people and people of color. But apparently this was not quite inclusive enough. So in 2021, a British equality rights activist named Valentino Vecchetti created this version with a yellow triangle with a purple circle in it. Valentino is intersex, and this new symbol is based on the intersex pride flag, which was created by an Australian intersex activist in 2013. Intersex describes the rather small community of people whose biological sex is rendered indeterminate in some way, usually relating to the nature of their sexual organs. People used to use the term hermaphrodite, but that's a pretty offensive word now. Anyway, I feel like 2024 saw this version of the pride flag achieve mainstream status in terms of being the flag increasingly the most likely to be displayed as a symbol of tolerance for sexual and gender diversity in shops and schools and government buildings and things, as well as at official LGBT+ celebrations. The new flag hasn't been without controversy, of course. It is popular to say that the pride flag is suffering from a bit of identity politics creep, in the sense of getting more and more complicated as new groups insist on explicit recognition. There's also a sense that intersex people, who probably number around 1% of the population, just aren't a big enough group to deserve nearly 12% of the pride flag's real estate. But when it comes to these sorts of things, most people do err on the side of inclusivity, so for now, this seems like the symbol of tolerance we're going to be seeing for a while, although you would be justified to suspect that this might not be the final form. My next inclusion is maybe a little bit controversial. It is the concept of tech oligarchs. Now, obviously, the tech sector has been a big part of the American economy for quite a while now, and certainly wealthy tech CEOs like Bill Gates have been characters in American life for close to 3 decades. But oligarch is a different term. It refers to the idea of people who combine wealth with political power, which is something that tech people have historically not been that interested in until now. I feel like 2024 was a moment in which it became pretty undeniable that a new generation of tech company CEOs who had acquired their wealth from building internet platforms and increasingly crypto and AI as well were interested in politics in a way that the tech billionaires of the personal computer era were not. People like David Sachs, Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, and of course Elon Musk are all unapologetically political and politically outspoken, stating bluntly what they believe the American political system should and shouldn't do, and not being shy about throwing around their money to achieve it. People sometimes use terms like tech bro or oligarch to describe them, in part because a lot of them have political views that are kind of reactionary and chauvinistic in a stereotypically macho, masculine way, while also being very progressive when it comes to their faith in the power of technology to better humanity. Like I said, the idea of rich guys having a lot of power isn't unto itself a culturally new phenomenon, but partially because of the high-profile way that many of the broligarchs chose to become outspoken Trump supporters in the 2024 election, this year really feels like the moment in which we began to think of this crop of characters as like a coherent group, and I dare say they may even prove to be the most famous and identifiable group of such people since the notorious robber barons of the late 19th century. And lastly, talking about blasts from the past, how about Steamboat Willie? 2024 was the year that Steamboat Willie, the first ever Mickey Mouse cartoon, officially entered the public domain. And it's a moment that I think represents a very dramatic development in the history of American pop culture. As I explained in depth in an award-winning video I made a while back, public domain is when a fictional character or universe stops being protected by copyright and instead becomes something that anyone can use and make money from. All creative works have to become public domain eventually. It's in the US Constitution. But I feel like during the late 20th century, it was easy to assume that some things never would, especially the works of mega corporations like Disney. And to be fair, companies like Disney have lobbied hard over the years to get Congress to extend their copyright protections as long as humanly possible. But despite it all, Steamboat Willie still became public domain anyway, and this triggered an abundance of suddenly legal and often quite weird Mickey Mouse art and merch. And there's only going to be more and more of this as more and more Mickey Mouse cartoons start to enter the public domain, and the whole Mickey Mouse universe, accordingly, begins to transition into something like the Wizard of Oz, with all these fun characters that anyone can use for anything, even if some people continue to use them better than anyone else. Okay, now let me close out with a few honorable mentions. These are some cultural things that I feel had a big influence in 2024, but I'm not yet sure just how lasting their cultural relevance will be. Sean Diddy Combs was indicted in September on multiple charges of sex crimes, but also, as the New York Times put it, being head of a sprawling criminal enterprise since at least 2008 that included his employees and engaged in kidnapping, forced labor, arson, and bribery. This represented a pretty dramatic downfall of one of the leading figures in modern American hip-hop culture, but he's not scheduled to go to trial until late spring, so it feels premature to declare just how dramatic or definitive this downfall will wind up being. Speaking of ruined hip-hop legacies, the epic musical feud between superstars Drake and Kendrick Lamar was definitely one of the biggest entertainment stories of the year, with both men engaged in an all-out war to destroy the other's reputation. This was one of those cultural things where basically every culturally literate person was expected to take a side, and as someone who has always resented what fellow Canadian Drake has done to this country's reputation, I was obviously on Team Kendrick. His anti-Drake diss track, Not Like Us, proved to be the most listened to hip-hop single of the year, according to Spotify, and the second most streamed song in the US, period. None of Drake's diss tracks, by contrast, made it into the top 10 at all. But that said, Drake also earned the #2 spot on Spotify's 2024 list of America's most streamed artists, and was named the most popular hip-hop artist of the year in the Billboard rankings. So this suggests that 2024 wasn't entirely defined by a complete collapse of Drake's standing as an artist due to Kendrick's withering bars, but I guess we will have to see how his career fares from here. And finally, we got Concord. I often have a hard time knowing how to fit video games into the American cultural canon, just because there are so many of them these days, and it can be hard to tell when one really breaks through into the mainstream cultural consciousness. I actually did a whole video exploring this topic as well a while ago. But that said, the game Concord made the news this year, not because it was popular, but because it wasn't. Released by Sony in August, it was hyped as the next Fortnite or Overwatch, you know, a first-person shooter set in a whimsical sci-fi setting where you would primarily play against friends and strangers online. But it wound up being a colossal flop, with early sales coming nowhere close to reclaiming the $100 million it cost to make. After just 11 days on the market, Sony announced that they were ceasing sales and offered all customers a full refund. Online support was pulled a few days later. Why the game went over so poorly has been the subject of endless video essays here on YouTube, and having watched a few, it doesn't seem like there was any one single consensus. It reminds me a lot of like a big Hollywood flop, like John Carter of Mars, where there was just way too much money spent on an overly ambitious project that wound up being poorly executed and off-putting in all sorts of different ways. In any case, Concord is now almost certainly the most costly bomb in video game history, and in that sense might wind up achieving the same legendary cultural status as the Nintendo Virtual Boy or that notorious E.T. game for the Atari that they had to bury in the desert. Or it might not, just because, like I said, video games sometimes just don't penetrate the mainstream cultural consciousness in the way that other forms of media do. But you guys can let me know if you think we'll still be talking about Concord like a decade from now. But before you go rushing to the comments to share your own thoughts about what mattered or didn't in 2024, let me just close with a new feature that I like to call JJ's Book of the Year. I get a lot of requests for book recommendations from my viewers, especially books that will help them improve their cultural literacy and learn more fact-based information about the world. And this year, I want to endorse a really good book that I think fits this particular bill. It is called Hitler's People by Richard J. Evans. Richard Evans is one of the world's leading scholars of Nazi Germany and has written many very long, very thorough history books about the Nazi regime. This book, however, is a much easier read. It is basically a series of short biographical summaries of all of the leading men and a couple of women of the Nazi government and the Nazi movement. These mini profiles are all confidently written and easily accessible to readers of all levels of knowledge. which really reflects Professor Evans' skill as a communicator. I realize this isn't the most uplifting subject in the world, but the people in this book are some of the great villains of human history, and it is important to know what, say, Goering did versus what Albert Speer did, as well as their distinct backgrounds and obsessions. This is a clear and concise guide that I guarantee will fill your gaps of knowledge and improve your ability to communicate with confidence about a very important period of history that continues to have a lot of relevance to our present moment. All right, with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to give me a like if you did, and don't forget to turn on that notification bell, people. It's the easiest way to keep on top of my upload schedule. I'm really excited for what we're going to get up to in 2025, the 10-year anniversary of this channel. Thank you so much for sticking with me or just joining now. Hope you guys all had a wonderful holiday season, and I will see you next week.